Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Brandis and I'm the program manager for the Colorado SBDC Network TechSource Commercialization Program. I'd like to welcome you all today to part 3 of the How to Write a Competitive SBIR STTR Proposal 3-part series. We're glad you could join us this morning. Very quickly, I'd like to introduce you to our Colorado SBDC TechSource Commercialization Program. This is designed to support science and technology ventures throughout the state of Colorado. Different from many accelerators and incubators that lead to equity funding, SBDC TechSource focuses on sources on non-dilutive and technology commercialization and SBIR grants. Colorado SBDC TechSource Commercialization is a specially designed program that taps subject matter experts such as Stephanie Amond today to provide you with direct assistance. This comes in the form of customized expert consulting at no cost to you and through relevant workshops and events. This year, all events and meetings are virtual. Some of the topics that we cover include SBIR, STTR, and advanced industry grant proposals and compliance, R&D tax credits, technology commercialization, IP protection and assistance with the patent process, market research, market sizing, strategic and tactical planning, access to capital, and much more. These resources are available thanks to support from SBA's FAST program, Visa, the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade, the Minority Business Office, Zero, and the City of Boulder. If you're a business located in a rural part of Colorado or are minority or women-owned, we may have additional resources to help, so please reach out. A few quick things. After this webinar, if you're interested in meeting one-on-one with an SBDC TechSource specialist or attending events, workshops, or webinars, please visit our website, which is sbdc-techsource.org to get started. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you're going to receive an email following the presentation with a link to the recording. You'll also receive a copy of today's presentation slides. Just a few housekeeping things. Everyone is currently on mute. If you have questions, please type them into the chat bar during the presentation, and we will try to get to them at the end. If you don't get your question answered, we will follow up afterwards. Also, if you did miss parts 1 and 2 of this series, you can still view them on our website. I'd now like to introduce you to today's webinar presenter, Stephanie Amond. We've been very fortunate to work with Stephanie for many years, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her now.
Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate it. Go ahead and get our last part ready to go here. So this is great that we were able to spend the last 2 sessions together, kind of learning more about what SBIR is, if it's a fit for you, how to determine if there's a way for you to participate, and then doing some evaluation and preparation. And now we're really going to talk about the submission process and kind of what to watch out for, and a couple of topics that are critical to thinking about whether or not you're going to submit a proposal and thinking about while you're writing the proposal, that I wanted to leave until the end because typically there's quite a lot of questions in these areas. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. But at this point, you know, if we're in real life, you've already written your proposal and you're looking at a looming submission date, and you're trying to figure out, okay, you know, are we ready to go, and what else do we need to consider, and what happens after it submits. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I use this term called a red team review, and if you've worked at, you know, any other large contractors or worked with a consultant before, you may have heard this, but essentially this is the last chance to take a look at your proposal and what we want to look for. We'll also talk about TABA, which is the Technical and Business Assistance Funding that the SBIR program provides. Intellectual property and TABA were both topics that we're going to spend a little bit time on because we have I tend to have quite a few questions in this area. And I'll touch just very briefly on cybersecurity because I want you to understand that this is important and becoming increasingly important in consideration of your business operations and participation in the program. And then all of the other little post-award considerations that turns into contract management. So we'll talk about what happens when you transition from, I went through all this proposal stuff and now you have to think about actually performing. And I have a little bit of extra time today for questions, just because, and we can talk about any questions from part 1, part 2, or 3, or anything that wasn't covered. So let's talk about the Red Team Review. So there's a few tools that I like to use with clients to participate in a review. And again, this is Red Team, meaning final, and team is, this is not just one person, hopefully, looking through the proposal. I really like to talk about using a team here. So a compliance matrix can be many things. Some people like to use a checklist. Some people like to use something fancy in Excel, but in its essence, you're pulling out all of the requirements from the solicitation and you're identifying whether or not that you completed them. If you haven't, I like to sometimes say who's the owner, when is it going to be completed by, who are we waiting on? I mean, these can be very complex and really kind of be a proposal management tool. Or, you know, if you've done SBIRs a lot, sometimes it's just distilled down to a checklist, you know, that I got my letter of support. I have my basis of estimate attachment, you know, I completed the fraud, waste, and abuse training, or whatever the case may be. You really should have some sort of document that is tracking your progress and verifying that you are indeed done with your proposal. Again, that word team, the crux of your proposal, you're going to focus so much on this technical element that the technical people who wrote it may not be the best reviewers of it because they've just looked at it over and over again and they totally have absorbed what they're trying to say. So I like sometimes to have technical people take a look at perhaps some of the pricing just to see if, you know, their statement of work actually matches up with their budget. But I really like to have non-technical reviewers take a look at the technical, just because they sometimes seem to be better at picking up grammar or a figure numbering that's out of place, or even from a layman's term, hey, I don't get what you're trying to say here, and it's not for the fact that I don't know engineering or whatever the case may be. So I kind of like to have a mixture of reviewers and people who are outside, and this is a lot of what I do for SBIR companies who may have been through rounds before. They're familiar with all the other bits and pieces, but sometimes they just need someone else to take a look at the technical narrative and see what they have. So one tool I like to pull out, and I'll do this with, you know, kind of in conjunction with a compliance matrix, is that I pull the topic back out. So forever ago, you found a topic and you liked it and you thought it was going to be good, and you may have gone back to it initially, but as you wrote and continued to write your technical narrative, you could have lost sight of what that topic was and what the objective of the agency may have been. So I typically pull out the topic again and I bump it up against the first section of most SBIR proposals, which is the identification and significance of problem. So I really want to see as a reviewer that your first words at me really resonate with the topic that I may have helped written, or, you know, that I'm there to evaluate. And so as an internal reviewer to your team, this is really helpful to have pulled out and right in front of you when you're reading. Having a pricing team review, sometimes this is called a green team if you wanted to separate it out, but you know, taking a look at the basis of estimate and matching the budget. So pulling the budget out, pulling out your basis of estimate. Does everything make sense? Are the rates and values correct? You know, does everything align with the statement of work? So kind of having a green team is another tool that you can use to ensure that your whole proposal is valid. And kind of creating this structure, we call it having the magic pen sometimes. And so you're going to have a review, and hopefully there's one reviewer at a time and they're editing, and you can kind of move that magic pen around to everyone, and then you call it and say, okay, you know, we've reviewed, we've edited, we've reviewed it, edited. To ad nauseum, we need to have final copy, and let's clean up the document. We're going to make it final copy. You know, using Word and track changes is the best way to do that. But you definitely need to give an internal time for pens down, because inevitably, and this is without fail, people will try to work until the very last moment, and then it's almost like you can overwork the proposal. And if you don't give yourself a drop dead time that nobody's touching this document forevermore, you could run the risk of being late, or, you know, changing something in one place and not having time to change it in another place of your proposal, and just kind of getting a little bit frazzled. So definitely give yourself a pens down time. So during the red team review, again, this is not like a moment in time. It can be. You can definitely, you know, virtually be in a conference room, or, you know, one day I'll be in a conference room together and go through it, you know, piece by piece. For some people, that's valuable. For most people, it is not, because you don't have enough time to do that. So kind of think of the red team review as like a process. And during that process, what to watch for, like little things. Are the forms or fields correctly filled out? You know, there's bits and pieces where you're going to have to say in one part of the proposal how much money you're asking for, and that needs to match to the budget that you're submitting. So make sure that those two numbers match. The font, the headers, footers, page count, margins, you know, these are all tiny things that make it really easy for the government to kick out all of your hard work, and it will never be read. So ensure that you take a look at the solicitation, look at all the format requirements, double check all of these things before you call it good. Again, back to your budget, make sure all the numbers are adding up, you know, that there's not a mistake in a formula in Excel or something like that. If you do have to submit supplemental documents using that compliance matrix or checklist, you make sure that you have them all accounted for, they're the right version. Say if you wrote a letter of support and you just asked someone to sign it for you, you actually have the signed version submitted, you know, little things like that. Ultimately though, you know, this is all the admin stuff, and that should be relatively easy, but I just don't want you to forget. But ultimately, throughout the entire proposal, has the state of art been demonstrated? So this is everything from the abstract that you wrote, you know, when we talked about that last week, to the technical narrative, to potentially a letter of support, or whatever the case may be. Truly, have you demonstrated the state of art? And that within your proposal, do you have references that validate that there is a established current baseline, and what you are proposing exceeds that baseline? So after you have reviewed this thing for all the admin, you've looked at your pricing, you know, you've had the grammar checked and the figures checked, and you've had people review this. Constantly, when you're reviewing your whole proposal, just have everyone who's looking at it think about, okay, has the state of art been demonstrated? Are we actually doing something novel, you know, cool, innovative? It's not just the next progression in industry that's going to happen on its own, you know, that like you really need this SBIR money to do something state of the art here. Some pitfalls when you're writing your proposal are things that hopefully you've caught before you arrived at Red Team. But at a minimum, during Red Team, pay attention to format. Think about who you've proposed as the principal investigator. We'll talk about that during the evaluation phase. They do not need to have a master's degree or a PhD, although I think it does help, because it does offer some legitimacy, because typically there's more publications or more projects or involvements that the PI has been in. But the PI is super duper important. You know, they have to be actually somebody who's going to lead the research. Again, lack of innovation, that's easy pitfall to fall into. A weak commercialization, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the evaluation factors. Unsupported pricing, so just throwing random numbers out there is definitely going to cause you some problems in evaluation. If you miss any Q&A or amendments to the solicitation, that definitely could be a pitfall, because you don't want to submit a proposal that a reviewer is going to look at and say, oh, well, you know, they totally missed the fact that we edited the topic, or that they made an assumption here that we clarified during Q&A. And, you know, you're just going to look like a fool and they'll just throw it out. So make sure you definitely look at that. Again, the easy stuff, like not getting it done on time and not allowing enough time for red team. Like I said, it typically is not just a point in time. You can't get all of this review done in just a meeting. So allow yourself some time, you know, perhaps a week, depending on how many eyeballs and pens that you need on the proposal. You know, give yourself enough time to really validate that your proposal is ready to go. Okay, so you've done the red team. You're ready to go. You're ready to get ready to get rid of this thing. Let's submit. So like, pay very, very close attention to the time zones and the due time. This happens quite often, especially as you get closer and more anxious about the due date. Ensure that you have your time zone correct, and you know when it's actually due. Provide yourself enough time for slowdown. Very good example was earlier this year when the DoD rolled out their new submission system. It was brutally slow, you know, slower than dial-up slow, slow enough for 2 hours to take one proposal, which it took maybe 15 minutes at the most, or if your computer's having issues. And so, you know, this could provide a huge issue. And the solicitation specifically says, I think in every SBIR solicitation, it says, you know, anticipate there could be a system issue or computer issue, you know, and that's something that you have to give yourself enough time for. So you've put everything in and you click submit, and you're wondering, did it do anything? The email should come to you that says that it was successfully submitted. I believe that there is one system that doesn't generate an automatic email. So typically, regardless, I like to go back out of the system and back in and take a look, you know, that either there's green check boxes against everything, that there's a lock icon next to your proposal, or, you know, something within the online system that has validated that everything's okay. If you are having issues during the submission process, I get on the phone right away. I typically am writing an email to the help desk while I'm on the phone, just in case. Again, there's so many reasons, and we won't get into all the reasons that help desks could fail you, but they often can. And so, but they often can help too. I don't want to be totally pessimistic, but I like having the email, because if I can't get through on the phone, I have proof that I tried to submit something. Case in point, sometime last year, I was submitting a missile defense proposal for a client. They were sitting right next to me. We had everything in, and the system kept telling us that it wouldn't submit because it was missing something, and there was no place to put that missing thing. It was a weird glitch or bug in the system, which was apparent to me because I'd been in there enough to know exactly what it should do. Called the help desk, no pickup, no phone call back. Emailed the PM, actually, because this was a phase 2, emailed the help desk. I mean, we had tons of documentation. The proposal looked like it was incomplete. We submitted actually the proposal via email as best as we could to the SBIR address that we had. I mean, we did everything, because on the outside, it looked like the proposal wasn't submitted. And it was not our fault. It was not the client's fault. It was completely the DoD's fault. And so because we had all of that documentation and background showing timestamps and attempts and all of that, they accepted the proposal after all. So Long story short, I just want you to just do everything you possibly can, because the likelihood of running into a bug or an issue, especially with DoD's new system, is not low. So once you get it all in and everything feels good, and hopefully you don't have any issues or bugs, then you just sit and wait. And it's gonna be kind of a hard few months, but it does take about 3 months until if you've notified if you have an award or not. Okay, so it went in, you're sitting there waiting, twiddling your thumbs, you know, what's happening on the other side, and that is highly agency dependent, but we'll just talk about the first steps of evaluation. So initially the proposals will be screened for responsiveness. So like the basic things have been met. Did you fill in the forms and the fields and, kind of that admin stuff. So admin stuff, you're good, you got everything. But there's also another layer to this, and it again, it's agency dependent, but so your proposal is administratively responsive, that's great. That would be sad if it wasn't, because that's something you can 100% control. For NASA, they go another step further in this evaluation step, but they look at your abstract, and this is NASA personnel, and they're going to say, oh yeah, I think that this thing does address NASA's interests, so we'll move on. So just, a lot of people, we always like to write the abstract at the end, because you haven't written your technical narrative yet. You really want the abstract to like be the distillation of your technical narrative. So pay attention to that abstract, because somebody will be reading it and deciding whether or not it has merit. The evaluation factors really kind of land into 3 general buckets, and those are innovation, capabilities of the team, and commercialization. So depending on the agency, there might be different words for these. So it might be scientific or technical merit, feasibility, intellectual merit. So really we're talking about the merit of the idea. Is it innovative? Again, back to that state of the art. So that is one evaluation factor in general. They're going to be looking at the experience and qualifications, facilities, going back to the principal investigator, the team as a whole, subcontractors. You're not some Yahoo off the street who just had this brilliant idea. Like, you legitimately have a company, a team, a background, even if it's a company of 2, who has a legitimate basis for proposing this idea and can legitimately and successfully pull off the research. And then the commercialization potential, the feasibility of that commercialization, is this actually realistic? The broader impacts of this idea, should it go out to the market? All of those things will be evaluated. And then depending on the agency, you might also see something about whether or not they think your work plan or statement of work is effective, if it makes sense, if it's valid. And then the price reasonableness. So this is really kind of interesting, and it goes back to things I've said in the past, is that you have a cap, obviously, and people always try to ask for the most money they can get, but that money, that ask, needs to match up to what you're proposing to do. So is that reasonable? And they will see all the different elements of your pricing. And so if you ask for a $20,000 chair that's supposed to be special for some reason, I don't know, that's not reasonable. So again, they're going to look at the elements of your cost for reasonableness as well. Because each agency is slightly different, and I'll give you guys some more agency specific information here shortly, but you're going to be focusing on the instructions. Off the bat, you're going to be building that compliance matrix. You're going to say, okay, what do we need to do? Don't forget to look beyond those instructions to the evaluation factors, because when you're writing your proposal, particularly, these 3 sections, innovation, team, commercialization, what is the agency really looking for? How are they going to score you? Do they have particular questions they want you to address? Is there a priority on these things? You know, do they care more about the innovation than they do about commercialization? So each agency is different. It will be posted in the solicitation. So read it carefully, because especially if you think that you might be weak in one of these areas, that might be an indicator to you that you need to work harder or dig a little deeper in order to bolster that weakness a little bit if it's a high scoring factor. And then use this methodology throughout your red team review as well. So if you have time to, kind of have a little bit more robust red team review, and I do this with my clients often, is that I pull out the evaluation factors and I say, okay, if I'm scoring you on these elements, I think that commercialization is super duper weak right now, and you have 2 days to beef that up because you only have 2 days left to get this in the door. So don't worry about building a new graphic right now. Worry about writing up a better commercialization plan. So, this is kind of what helps in your red team review to focus on what really needs to be done. So who is scoring this? This is all different depending on each agency. So NASA includes NASA scientists and engineers. They may have qualified experts outside of NASA to determine the merit of the proposal. DOE will use experts both inside and outside the government, and outside the government are typically, folks that are experts in their field, have signed up to be an evaluator, and are typically contractors. And then NSF specifically says they have a minimum of 3 experts, and that the program directors, select these people. So again, and you can offer yourself up as an expert too to review, but you just have to be careful. If you're an SBIR submitter and an SBIR evaluator, that could be a conflict of interest, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. But if you know people who want something to do, maybe they want to be an evaluator. So I often get a question about, I had a great proposal. I didn't really get any negative feedback, at least nothing I think that would kick me out, but I didn't get funded. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the agencies prioritize. As you saw in part 1, there's thousands of proposals that go against solicitations each year. And so there has to be some way to prioritize good proposals. So the solicitation should say, how if there's a prioritization methodology. The agency's website might say something about the prioritization methodology. Interacting, as we've said before, with the SBIR office is always really helpful. So for NASA, extra F in there, apologize, but for NASA, an example, they want to look at, okay, if we have 50 great proposals, but we can only award 20 of these, then we're going to look at first-time awardees, historically underrepresented communities, geographic, market stimulation, like what each of the mission centers, what their priorities may be, and that's how we're going to figure out the 20 out of the 50. For DOE, they look at, again, a balance of activities, how they're going to distribute the funds, performance, if they've ever had other DOEs, and then of course the availability of funds is important for them too. Kind of once they have their bucket of ones that they want to award, those will be forwarded for negotiations. Depending on the agency, it could go to a few different people. Those will again be evaluated, if they weren't already, for cost price reasonableness, and any weird stuff that the offeror may have said about terms and conditions. And then the contracting or grants officer may come back to you and ask you for additional questions, ask for additional documentation. NASA 100% of the time does this to you and will ask you for more information. Even if you already put it in your proposal, you have to give it to them again. They just have a standard thing. And then the contract is executed. And one thing I wanted to just pay attention is that not often, but sometimes they'll be ahead of the curve, and so you'll get an award, but the period of performance can't start yet. So just because you have an award, make sure you pay important importance to the start date, the actual period of performance start date versus the date that it's signed. If it's not selected for award, you should request a debrief. So this is something that they'll give you. They should give you guidance on. If not, contact the SBDC and they'll guide you on how to ask for a debrief. You know, you might get feedback that's valuable, sometimes it's not, but if you're gonna submit again, don't just focus on that one bit of feedback, because the time period between proposals could be very long. Topics could change, solicitation guidance could change, you know, you might have different reviewers. So it's important, but just don't solely focus on that. If you are going to apply a second time, you know, again, reach out in the time period in between solicitations to get more insight, update the proposal, try to understand if you had a negative comment and you just don't agree with that comment, try to look back at your proposal and see where did that comment come from? How did they misinterpret what you said? And go back and correct that. So if you had no apparent weakness, again, kind of going back to that prioritization, you know, just try to build upon those strengths, figure out maybe if there was a priority issue, and just try again. Sometimes that's just the way it is. It happens. Okay, so I'm going to kind of put a hard stop on proposals. So we went through the whole proposal process. It's submitted, you won or you didn't. I'm going to pull out a couple of these topics, which is TABA and intellectual property, and then I'll go into post-award. But you may or may not have heard about this technical and business assistance. It is extra money, essentially, that the SBA is telling agencies to give to companies to allow them to make better business decisions and help them solve some problems, both technically and administratively, to get them to commercialize. So they understand that, hey, companies, your goal is to commercialize, but then these small businesses don't necessarily have the financial resources or human resources to actually do that. You know, that takes some investment. So they've recognized this and they're providing extra funding. So this extra funding pays for all of these things: sales, IP, market research, validation, you know, overall commercialization, regulatory manufacturing plans, and, you know, just kind of this ancillary stuff that you need to have in place in order to successfully commercialize. So this is really good. And you may have heard of this in the past as just discretionary technical assistance. A couple of years ago, they turned this into TABA. Here are the TABA amounts by agencies. So you can see that a couple of agencies actually give you up to $50,000 for phase 2, which is amazing. Not all agencies participate with phase 1 TABA. So you'll just have to pay attention to those amounts. So how it works is that this is paid for by the agency. This is not anything you have to pay back. This is just additional money. You know, this is additional money for you to spend on most likely a subcontractor. So you bill the agency the TABA expenses, and you're responsible for paying your TABA provider, you know, whoever that is, some consulting firm or some 1099 or whoever it is that you choose. At the time of your proposal, you have to identify your intent. So some agencies have a pre-existing contracted TABA provider that you can tap into, and you don't have to, but you can always find someone else and bring them in to your proposal. So you'll have to submit some information about that person or consulting firm with your proposal, and you kind of have to identify at that time. In most cases, but it's again solicitation dependent, agency dependent, TABA is in addition to your awarded amount. So, you know, $100,000 award, you're going to get, you know, $106,500 because you asked for TABA. And if there are any commercialization assistance programs that the agency may offer you, and you have a TABA vendor, you may not be able to tap into those commercialization assistance programs. So just pay attention, you know, to which direction you want to go if you do have an option to tap into one or the other. But it's a really great opportunity to ask for extra money to help you do things that you don't otherwise have the money to do. I think the challenge is ensuring that you have enough time in your own personal schedule throughout the period of performance to use the money. So I think that's the hard part. And I can answer more questions about that later. And the SBDC knows a lot about TABA, and there's some really great tech source subject matter experts on that they can answer questions to. So intellectual property protection, I am going to sort of go through this fast. It's going to feel fast, but this could be a whole hour plus on its own. So my goal is just to identify for you that intellectual property is super important to think about here. So in industry, we use the word intellectual property. In the Federal Acquisition Regulation, it kind of buckets it into technical data, software documentation, and patents. And that's kind of what we call that IP. So any tech data or computer software that is developed during the SBIR with the SBIR funds only will be covered by SBIR data rights. This means that you're agreeing in your contract to give the government some license, not ownership, but license to what you're developing because they paid for it. Title to patentable inventions remains with your company as long as you follow reporting rules. And we won't get into those reporting rules. It's something I can help you with, but just know that you get to retain ownership, and particularly you still get to patent under these contracts. So again, you get to own and has full right and title to all the data you develop. So don't worry about giving up ownership. A lot of people who have angel investors or VC, some money, kind of get concerned about this topic. You get to retain ownership. But the government does get a royalty-free license to use the tech data, and it's for only government purposes. And I'll tell you, it just never, ever seems to happen. They don't have the resources to manage half of what they already have, let alone rights to things that they could have right to. I have a little disclosure here. So the SBA changed the protection period last year from 4 or 5 years to 20 years. And I won't get into all the details. If you're already familiar with SBIR data rights, we can have a separate call about this change. So the DoD has officially implemented a 20-year protection period. The rest of the government will soon follow. So until then, there's only a 4-year protection period on all the civilian agencies. But essentially that just says, government, your license is super small and limited on what government purpose is. And then after those 20 years, it opens up because it assumes that by then your technology is probably going to be obsolete. It's not going to be valuable anymore. So upon that expiration, the government gets government purpose rights under the new 20-year model. If your contracts are under the old 4 or 5-year model, at the end of the protection period, they get unlimited rights. Again, a different class, I can tell you all about the difference of what rights are within each of these categories, but just know that there are some slight differences. So the limited use is really evaluation of award, using it within their own programs and missions. There's not much that they do. Some might have an interest in accessing the data to explore applications. Again, and that doesn't necessarily happen in real life, but you can definitely look at these policy directives to give you more idea of what the government's rights may be. For pre-existing IP, so stuff that you paid for and it already exists, you're going to be using it, it can be protected a lot more, and we call these limited or restricted rights. And if you had something that is pre-existing and it had a mixed funding, it was developed with government and private funds, and it goes into this other bucket, which is government purpose. And you might have prior SBIR data rights that are going to be moving from one SBIR to another. I'm just put an asterisk that the contracting officer may not always agree to move those rights, and I can't get into that today, but we can help you with that if you get into that situation. If you have a pre-existing patent and you're going to be using it in your SBIR, the government is just like any other customer, and that patent is protected just like it would be on the outside world, so you don't have to worry about that. And if you have commercial rights, say you have commercial software that you developed exclusively at private expense, you're already selling it, and you have an end user license agreement, the government has to respect that EULA just as much as any other commercial customer would. So just know that all these existing rights, that the stuff that you're bringing into this project that you've already paid for and developed, has a lot more restrictions and is locked down on what the government can do with it in that license. So best practices when you protect IP is you need to assert, if you have any of this pre-existing stuff, and this is something that I talk through with clients all the time, what do you assert during the proposal phase or negotiations phase? What do you tell them you have, and say, hey, government, just so you know, we're bringing this in and it's going to be protected. You have to raise the hand right in the beginning to let them know that could happen. You also need to protect it during performance. So this, you may have something that that was created outside of your SBIR that you need to assert during performance. You definitely need to mark everything appropriately per the clauses in your contract, and that's something that we can help with. Tracking your internal IP development, you have to really identify what was created with whose money when you're working in the federal government. So that's super duper important. Even like a lab book or timesheets, those are the best way to do those things. Understand rights and ownership. You have ownership, you have title, but because you're taking government money, you are giving a little bit of rights away. And understand the time limits for your SBIR data protection. It's really important for when you're marking your deliverables. And then always report possible inventions on time and per the contract requirements. So again, this is super high level, 30,000 feet. I'm just throwing this at you so that you understand that this is really important in an R&D world. So for post-award considerations, kind of going into, okay, I know about TABA, I know about IP, what else could come at me? As I become more successful in this program, or I get more awards, or I get into phase 2, what else can come at me? And I'm going to preface all of this, again, this could be a whole nother class, but I'm going to preface this with, you have government money. So the government expects you to spend it in a way that they have required everyone to spend it through regulations. So if you're purchasing or subcontracting, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, regulates that. It could be tested by the Department of Defense at some point too. They're going to make sure that you're doing it correctly. So if you don't know what correct purchasing subcontracting is, then reach out, because you're spending taxpayer money essentially. And if you don't do that right, you could be in a lot of trouble. So no, that's just what I just said. Expect you're spending taxpayer money. You might have audits. We talked about this in part 2. So make sure that you have an accounting and timekeeping system that's sufficient. And if you're DoD and you get into phase 2s, you might have to do these other annual accounting things like an incurred cost proposal and audits. And so just be aware, if you're saying, hey, I want an SBIR from the Army and I want to go phase 1, phase 2, I want phase 3. You are going to have to invest some time and expense in an accounting system and some administrative requirements here. There's also government property management. If you're purchasing anything with government funds, there are some rules and triggers about what it becomes government property and what you have to track and report and become audited on. There could be timekeeping regulations and rules. You might want to invest in a timekeeping system. And then if you have a DOE contract, for example, you might, at a certain point of receiving X dollars of SBIR revenue from the DOE, you will have to do an external audit. They don't have an internal one like DOD does, and you get to pay for it. So there's all these extra things. I also wanted to just bring up the fact that, we talked about this a little bit, I think in part 1, that there are performance benchmarks, that the goal is to transition from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. And they SBIR program gives you ratios, and indexes, and they review those. And the triggers are once you receive, one of the triggers is that once you receive 15 phase 2s in the past 5 years, and if you're on this call, you're probably well before this. So this could be something way out in the future, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but just know that once you receive so many 1s and so many 2s, they expect you to do something with those. So this slide's more for your reference if you're curious about it, but there's 2 things they measure. One is a transition rate. So if you are an SBIR phase 1 applicant and you have 21 or more awards of phase 1s in the last 5 fiscal years, except for the last one, you need to have at least a 0.25 ratio of 1s to 2s. So you need to show success that you're not just getting 1s and stopping. You need to, if you have so many phase 1s, you have to have at least won so many phase 2s. And so this company transition rate should be displayed on your registry page on SBIR.gov. But if you don't have 21 phase 1s, you'll see it not applicable. The benchmark doesn't apply to you yet, and that's fine. That's not negative. There's also a commercialization benchmark. So this is, how you're doing from phase 2 awards to additional sales and investments, phase 3, air quotes. So I'm not going to dig into this, but you might just want to be curious, like how they calculate this commercialization benchmark. However, of course, as always, SBA is reevaluating the use of this benchmark, and that each agency solicitation will have its own, calculation, or, they might not be using the benchmark or whatever. There's not consistency in this area yet, but just know you're going to be graded at some point on how well you get additional investment off of that phase 2. And if you fail, once a year they look at all this, and if you fail, you won't be able to do another phase 1 award for at least 1 year from the date that you're told that you failed. And one last quick slide, and I won't get into this very much, but I just want you to think in your head again about additional investment, administrative requirements. So cybersecurity in the SBIR program is becoming super duper important. I was just reading this morning about how Russia has been hacking into United States and Canadian research institutions trying to grab COVID vaccination research data. So just know that, foreign adversaries definitely have an interest in research that's being done in the United States. And there's cybersecurity clauses that will end up in your contract. There's 2 of them here. The DFARS is the DoD one. But essentially it goes into compliance about your entire IT system. This DFARS clause is really robust. It's very heavy, complicated. Most likely somebody you're going to have to hire to help you out. It's been around for a while. There is a push to have sort of like certification levels. Those are supposedly coming this fall. And if you don't meet certain certification levels, you cannot propose on a particular solicitation. So the National Cyber Exchange Group has some good information and status updates on what's happening with the DoD. And the word on the street is that the rest of the government's going to follow the DoD here. And so if DoD is going to be a significant customer of yours, you want them to be, even if you're an IT company at its core, pay close attention to this, because you don't want to get into the program and then find out that you can't continue to participate because you can't meet these cybersecurity requirements. So take a look at this, contact the SBDC, and they can kind of help you out here. Some useful websites regarding proposal preparation, reviewing guidelines, and some of this stuff about data right and cybersecurity I have here. So the NSF gives some really good step-by-step instructions in the proposal preparation booklet. And then they also have a really good peer review guidelines page that would be really helpful to see. And then SBIR.gov has a whole suite of tutorials that are pretty good. And their data rights and cybersecurity tutorials, if you have an hour or so to sit down in each of these areas, I'd highly recommend taking a look at both of them, just so that you understand these two critical areas that could definitely come back to bite you. And, you know, knowledge is your best defense here. Okay, so I wanted to give a little bit more time for questions. And so again, if there's questions from part 1 through part 3 or nothing in those parts, you just want to ask a question, hopefully I can answer. So Jamie, I will switch it back over to you. Thank you for drinking from this fire hose today.
Thank you, Stephanie. There's so much information, and I know it's hard to get everything into even 3 parts. So I think it's fantastic that you've been able to do this. So thank you for that. Just gonna go back to my slide real quick. Okay, so if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat bar, and I'm happy to start asking them. So we do have one that they're asking, should I pursue the agreements first before the application process? And they're referring to agreements with subcontractors and partners.
One thing I like to recommend, and sometimes you don't have time for this, is a teaming agreement. So you don't need to enter into a full-blown subcontract with anybody, but at a minimum, non-disclosure agreement. For sure. So if you're going to be talking ideas, absolutely, before you even say go, green light on a proposal, non-disclosure agreement. If you are saying go, green light, but you're a little nervous about them being pulled to somebody else, or you just want a little bit more, I don't know what the word is, but you just want to feel better about them being on your team and you want a pre-existing agreement about how you're going to play together, then a teaming agreement would be in order. I typically don't see those in phase 1 though. You know, it's just too fast to get these done. If you're in the STTR program, you will need to get like essentially a data rights agreement in place with them. And there is a template that you can use. So you do need to have a data rights agreement in place for your proposal if you're going STTR.
Great, thank you. So let's see here. How important are letters of support, and how many would you recommend when you're applying?
So some agencies don't allow them, so pay really close attention to the solicitation. But if they do, I think they're very helpful because it gives validity to the reviewer that there is a commercialization potential here, and that somebody out there, because the support should say, this is a great idea. And I think it's a great idea because my company would purchase it, or, you know, I would provide, say it's another government agency, I would provide additional funding to continue this and put it in my mission, or whatever the case may be. So it definitely helps with that commercialization score. And it can also help incidentally via like, this is a great idea because we've been looking for something like this and it doesn't exist, and that can help your innovation score. And honestly, when people ask me how many, you know, I like seeing 3, but if you have 1, that's great. If you had 6, I kind of be like, oh, that's great. You had 6, but how did you have time to get 6? So I don't know. That's just my personal opinion.
Great. So I think you kind of answered this, but this person's asking for a micro business that has 2 employees and 2 contractors. Are they too small to submit an SBIR?
Not at all. You just have to think about how you're going to accomplish the work that you're proposing, and that the 2 employees have to do, you know, depending on all other costs, essentially the employees have to do 2/3 of the work on a phase 1. So if you have 2 contractors, you know, that might not work out, you know, in terms of number of labor hours. You can always propose someone who doesn't exist yet. So if you like just need a technician and they don't exist, but if you win, you'd hire them, you can put in a technician and just kind of put TBD in the basis of estimate if required. You talk about that, and so that could help you out.
Awesome. And then if there are gaps in your team, does it make sense to have an advisory board? Is that something that they consider, or is it like you need to be hiring people?
So it depends on where the gaps are. If they're a technical gap, then you should definitely hire somebody, or if the work ratio works out, you know, hire a consultant for that gap. If it's a business gap, like a CEO or CFO sort of gap, then that's not something to be as worried about, because we're looking up at the qualifications of the team to successfully commercialize and do technical. So technical people can do commercialization on their own, especially if you ask for TABA funding and you can help pay for the gaps in IT, manufacturing, marketing, you know, then you don't need to supplement your team. So it kind of depends on where the gap may be. I don't necessarily think advisory boards help, because the people you're speaking to are, you know, experts technically and scientifically, and they try to be experts commercially too. But they, you know, again, like an advisory board may not lend a ton of merit unless you think that there's some other glaring gap that fills somehow.
Okay, great. This person is asking, do I need to submit the calculations behind my indirect labor rate in the supporting documents, or is that proprietary information?
It is proprietary information. Proprietary information is protected as long as it's marked appropriately in your proposal. But no, I can't think of any agency that requires you in the initial phase of the proposal to provide the calculation of indirect rate. But many of them will ask you potentially during negotiations to provide that. Each agency is different on what they consider to be an allowable indirect rate and how much they dig into it. So that just goes back to, it's great to have that backup because you may need it, but it's not a supporting document requirement. A budget narrative theoretically could have it, but what I like to put in the budget narrative is just essentially how the indirect rate was arrived at using words rather than numbers. You know, like it's based upon, you know, total modified cost base or something like that. You know, it includes paid leave, 401k, and all that, and just kind of use words instead if I have a budget narrative I need to submit.
Okay. I think this person just wants a little further clarification on the advisory board. So they're saying, are you saying yes to an advisory board if it helps with a certain purpose?
I have never, well, I shouldn't say never. I have probably once or twice only seen an advisory board referenced in a proposal. The only place to put it is in, you have like a key personnel section. So if one of the key personnel is doing technical research, and you can talk about the advisory board, or in the commercialization section, you can talk about an advisory board and how that's going to help commercialize, then yes, go for it. But I don't think it, you know, it kind of goes back, and you have to be very clear if those advisory board members are paid with the SBIR funds or not, and why they're important. So you have to tell the reviewer why that advisory board is important. So, but my personal experience is that the advisory board may not lend any points if there is not a true purpose behind commercialization or research.
Great, thank you. So we're about up on time, but if you didn't get your question answered today, please let us know, and we will also follow up with you after this presentation, or if you come up with questions, let us know. Again, our website is sbdc-techsource.org. You can request consulting there, and we also have recordings. Parts 1 and 2 of the series are located there as well. In the follow-up email, we'll include those links as well as a link to the presentation slides from today. And with consulting, I am your first point of contact, so I will connect you to resources from there. Stephanie, thank you again so much for doing this series. I think it's been really helpful. This is something we get a lot of questions about. So thank you again. Hope everyone has a good day.
Thanks, everybody.